morning, everyone. Welcome to the Parliamentary Pavilion. It's delightful to have you here, both in person as well as on screen on our live stream. My name is Mala Nimhera. I'm Chief Executive of Globe International and delighted to welcome you to day 9 here at COP28, where we're going to be discussing Action for Climate Education, ACE, in particular that involving young people and parliamentarians. Of course, that's the theme of today, which is big focus on youth, on skills, on education. So we're going to share with you some of the work that we've been doing with young people through schools, in particular engaging local constituency members of parliament. It's an initiative which started in the United Kingdom some 5 years ago now, but has now spread around the world, particularly to the continent of Africa. And I have two colleagues here who are going to join me in telling the story about how we've been working with young people, with students, with schools, with teachers, with members of parliament in Nigeria, in Senegal, and what our plans are for the future. But if I can just begin with the story, where it began. So where the story of the student MP climate surgeries, as we refer to them, began was in 2019. And that was at an event called London Climate Action Week. So if I can just invite you to move to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so this is London Climate Action Week. It's an initiative which began in 2019. London Climate Action Week is now the largest independent climate change event in the world. This year in 2023, it was our 5th edition. The purpose of it is to harness the power of London for global climate action. This takes place at multiple levels, at a local level in London, but also at an international level, leveraging the many different connections that London has to the rest of the world through its very international, very diverse population, as well as our links to the rest of the world through trade, diplomacy, culture, investment, etc. Next slide, please. At London Climate Action Week, we have, every year we focus on 4 themes. The first theme is on driving a green, fair and resilient climate transition. The next theme is always on the road to the COP. So this year it was COP28 in terms of adaptation and ambition. The third theme is mobilizing the whole of society, all of London, its diverse populations. And fourthly, it's about creating a sustainable net zero London by 2030, which is a target that we have for net zero for the City of London. Next slide, please. Now, the student MP climate surgery that we have, which is one of the ways in which we have engaged constituency-based NG members of parliament with the young people in their constituency, is through an initiative that we started also in 2019 called the Schools Climate Summit. Next slide, please. The Schools Climate Summit is very unique because it doesn't just focus on young people and climate education. It actually looks at the school as an ecosystem, as a community which brings together many different stakeholders. So we talk about the 5 themes, which are the 4 C's and the 1 F. So the 4 C's refer to campus, curriculum, community, careers. And the 5th theme, the F, is for finance. Next slide, please. These are our partners. You'll see that we engage London's major institutions, from the Mayor of London and London councils to a number of initiatives, the Global Action Plan, the Grantham Research Institute, Let's Go Zero. So these are institutes, academic institutes and campaign organizations, but also the private sector, Thames Water, institutions such as British Council, etc., etc. So all of these combine in our work, both at London Climate Action Week as well as the Schools Climate Summit. Next slide, please. As part of London Climate Action Week, we have been producing what we call the London Climate Curriculum. Now, this uses London as the testbed to understand what climate change means in a very practical level for people living in London, and also what its implications are for the rest of the world, as London is an actor influencing decisions, behaviors, practices, and impacts in other parts of the world. So as you can see in the curriculum, we have 4 modules. This is a curriculum which is available to all schools across London, 3,500 schools, for free. It's available always at the beginning, 1 year ahead of London Climate Action Week, and it covers 4 themes. So the first is understanding climate change. Is there really anything that we can do about climate change? The other is to look at the practical ways to reduce London-specific climate risk, so young people understand what the risks are of climate change in a city like London. And those are principally risks around heat, drought, floods, as they are in many other metropolitan parts of the world which are highly urban, but specifically for London because it's a city on a river. The final module deals with engaging with your Member of Parliament on London's climate issues. And this is quite unique because London is very different from other parts of other major cities in that we have an preponderance of members of parliament who are London MPs. So in the UK context, there are 650 members of parliament, of whom 1 in 9 are London members of parliament. In London, we have 73, some of whom are front bench members of parliament, very prominent, who are constituency MPs. So through the London Climate Curriculum, we'd work with teachers and with young people to engage them 1 month ahead of London Climate Action Week in a conversation with their members of parliament, where they write to the members of parliament about what are the issues that concern them. And this is a very special relationship because young people don't really understand the political and the civic setup that there is in their countries typically. And so this is a way of increasing their literacy about civics, understanding how the political system works, and understanding, importantly, the role of their member of parliament as opposed to other politicians that they may be much more familiar with, such as the Mayor of London. So their constituency MP is mandated to represent his or her constituents' interests. So through these mechanisms, through these the letter writing campaign, having members of parliament coming and speaking with students in their schools, in their constituencies, it breaks down barriers, it improves understanding, it improves the conversation. Next slide, please. So this year, of course, we had and this is always on the Friday of London Climate Action Week, when we have these student MP climate surgeries take place. And the reason that for it always being on a Friday is because it takes its leave from the campaign which Greta Thunberg initiated in 2018-2019 called Fridays for the Future. Now, with the campaign, with these young people, with the climate strikes, what would happen is that they would go to parliaments and strike on a Friday, hence the term Fridays for the Future. In the UK context, marching to Parliament on a Friday doesn't really have an impact because on Fridays, it's a constituency day in the UK. It's when members of Parliament are not in Parliament, they're in their constituencies. So again, this was part of our effort to educate young people about, well, if you're focusing on Fridays, make sure you're focusing on where your MPs are. They're not in Parliament, they're in their constituencies. Hence, the focus always on the first Friday of London Climate Action Week, where we always have these student MP climate surgeries. Next slide, please. So as part of the Schools Climate Summit, we attempt to produce annually a school survey of where schools are on each of the 5 themes, and this reflects some of them. I won't go into great detail here because I'm keen to move on to the other things that we've been doing. So the next slide, please. Now, in 2021, we did a couple of interesting things. Of course, we had the Student MP Climate Surgery engaging members of Parliament in London, but importantly, for the first time, we went national. We went national in the nation of Scotland because Scotland was hosting COP26. And so at COP26 in Scotland, a few days ahead of it, next slide, please, we organised with Scotland's Children's Parliament and Youth Parliament. Scotland is one of the very few countries which has both a Children's Parliament as well as a Youth Parliament. We worked with them to initiate a special day of climate dialogue, which was called The Moment, between young people and their elected representatives across Scotland. Next slide, please. And we brought the results of these conversations, the moments, to the opening of the COP26 Legislators Summit. So the summit began with the young people sharing their reflections on and the recommendations that they had undertaken with the members of parliament in that dialogue, the moment, and they brought that message to the world's legislators at the COP26 Global Legislators Summit. Next. So now we are gone international. From the nation of Scotland, we've moved to the continent of Africa. And so this, you see a picture of the very first student MP climate surgery, which was held in Rivers State in Nigeria. And on this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues from Nigeria, starting with Mr. Nameka Oru. And Nameka, if I can invite you to come here and share the rest of the story as you led it in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Malini. Really pleased to be here to talk about what we were able to do. But it's important to say that for us in Nigeria, the whole thing started with the experience from the Globe COP21 Legislator Summit at the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. You know, I was there and I witnessed some of the students that were part of the moment coming to make presentations. So I felt like this is something we have to replicate in Africa, especially as COP27 was going to was referred to as the African COP. So in thinking about that, two things went through my mind then. One was the fact that we needed to create more awareness, increase the level of awareness in schools when it comes to issues of climate change. Well, again, critically, I was thinking about along the trajectory of the fact that, you know, if you have children and students talking about this, trying to engage MPs, it's going to make them more interested in conversations about climate change, and it could also make them take it more seriously. So what we did after that was to begin to brainstorm on how we are going to get this done. Initially, we planned to have it done just in Nigeria, but along the line, we thought about it. Why not move on to other African countries? So we were able to do two, one in Senegal, representing the Francophone side of Africa, and then one in Nigeria, representing the Anglophone side of Africa. So in Nigeria, we were able to do this in four states and the federal capital. You know, the federal capital in Nigeria is also often referred to as Nigeria's 37th state. So we were able to do it in Lagos, in Osun, Rivers, Abia State, and then the federal capital territory. You know, so and one of the things that we thought about was how do we make it such that this is about what works for Nigeria and not exactly the UK model, you know. And we thought that the best thing for us to do was to get these kids together and get them to write letters to their legislators, telling them exactly what they want them to do and asking questions about what they are doing about the climate change issue in the country. In Rivers, we went a little bit deeper because we noticed that there was an opportunity to engage legislators in person. You know, so in addition to writing the letters, we were able to get legislators in person to come and talk about these issues. I don't want to appropriate anything to us, but one thing that was very, very important about the Rivers State student MP climate surgery was the fact that the environment chair of the Rivers State House of Assembly was present, you know, at that particular event. And just a few months later, Rivers State passed their Climate Change Act. That's the only Nigerian state with the Climate Change Act, you know. So perhaps we played a role in getting that done, you know. And the reason why I say this thing is because some of the pupils that we interacted with, that we got to get that became interested in this whole thing, were kids of some of these legislators, and it's really, really interesting to see your child come back home and ask you, what are you doing about climate change in your role as a legislator? You know, I remember that for the one that we did at the National Assembly, one of the legislators who spoke to us and who moved on to carry on about this conversation had his child do a video, you know, really asking questions about what are you doing as my legislator to address issues of climate change, you know. So I think that it's critical that we begin to explore this more often, especially in developing countries or developing continents, you know. And I think that Africa needs to also push more for these type of things because from my experience in dealing with politicians and everything, I see that one of the things that pushes them to take action is when any particular issue has what I call political currency. And to have political currency, it has to be something that is present, that they see that their constituents are talking about every time. So they want to leverage on that. They want to be a part of it. And what better way to do this than having your kids come back home every day and ask you, Daddy, do you know anything about climate change? What are you doing about climate change? How are you doing? What exactly are you doing as a legislator to drive up this action. I'll stop here for now, but I will come back to talk more about this after Sam's intervention. Thank you. Yeah, so let me introduce my colleague Sam. Sam is the policy and media officer for Globe Nigeria. Of course, a very enterprising young man who has been driving climate action far better than I have been. So it will be interesting to hear his views.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Nemeka, and then thank you, Manini. It's really a pleasure and also an honor being here today. I remember my first intervention with Globe. That was through Rep Sam Onibo when I had a net zero interview with him about Nigeria's plan for net zero, looking at what the president said at COP26 about Nigeria's trajectory, meeting net zero in 2060. And that interview bettered my participation with Globe. And since then, it's been like a great platform of opportunities. Moving on to the student MP, I felt really, really opportune to be part of that particular initiative because it didn't just bet something that is a one-off event, but it bettered something in the hearts of students to know first about their environment, second that there are people they could hold accountable, and third that they also have a role to play, especially concerning their future. Because, for instance, starting with the Oshun student MP, we engaged with the students and we asked them if they knew anything about climate change. They couldn't actually give a precise stuff about climate change, but bringing it down to their level of understanding to ask them some environmental changes they have been able to experience exacerbated by the climate. They were able to point out a lot of things, including flooding. Apart from flooding, they also pointed out land degradation, droughts, farmers not being able to go to farm to cultivate anymore, cost of food, commodities has actually skyrocketed drastically. These were some things they pointed out that has never happened, but it's just happening. And I asked them, so what do you think is necessary solutions? They pointed out some couple of solutions, taking actions, responsible waste disposal, stop cutting down of trees and all. And we also asked them, do you think there are people that this message needs to reach out to? Do you think there are people that you can actually hold accountable for in these areas? And do you think you as a student, you can be able to write to your members of parliament? They said yes, they can do that. They can hold them accountable, that if they actually know that this is happening and they are not doing anything, then why are they elected in that position? So they started writing letters to their members of parliament in Osun State. We got those letters sent across, and they were really, really they were so surprised that this is climate change. But I feel part of what the student MP did for them was closing that knowledge gap, giving them that spotlight that climate change is not as ambiguous as people seem it to be. Because what is happening right now is when people say climate change is not real, is because of that ambiguous term climate change, and there is no environmental interpretation to project that this is climate change. And for River State, the River State student MP was also an interesting thing for me, because in fact that was more like a whole lot of effort we put in, because I know Nemeka and I, the whole back and forth, in fact we had to make like 5-second decision, let's do this, and it was really important, because at the event itself, we saw students not just asking questions but provoking questions to their members of parliament. I can remember a student asked the chair for the environment committee in River State. He was like, "We elected you in this position, and this is happening." Especially the suitcase in River State, he said, "This is happening. As our parliament we elected, what have you been able to do?" So they were actually holding their members of parliament accountable, and I feel this student MP shouldn't just stop at where it is right now, but I know that we are going beyond where it is right now to even get members of parliament to have a direct communication with students, to know what they actually want, and beyond just that, to know that these students, their future is at risk. And if they don't take action right now and listen to what they are saying in addressing climate change issues, it's going to even go worse than what it is right now. And with that, I think we just hand it over to Nameka. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sam. Rivers State is a very a unique case. First of all, the bulk of the revenue from Rivers State comes from fossil fuels.
Yeah, true.
So it's actually a very, very interesting case. So it was important to see them become the first state in Nigeria to have a climate change act. Nobody expected that it was going to be Rivers State. Everybody thought it was going to probably be perhaps Lagos. But somehow it became a Rivers State. And I think that what was critical in making this happen, apart from of course the effort that we put in, was the fact that the suit issue that you mentioned. So people began to see this as an existential issue.
And I'll just spotlight that the suit issue that we mentioned, Globe played a major role in making sure that bill came, because I remember in that student MP, when we carried it out, the chairman promised that act, replicating it, domesticating it in Rivers State, will happen as soon as possible. And immediately we finished that, they placed communications across that they are working towards the whole process. And it was also great to see the swift implementation of the whole thing. So I feel Globe intervention, that student MP, was a major drive, because for you to see students telling you that we are dying of this, and for you to know that students, actually not just students but children, know what is happening and their lives is at risk, is something that brought their attention to take a lot of bold step in bringing that up. Because before we even came to Rivers State, there have been a lot of setback. Like we had a lot of setback that they are not willing to do this, they need that. But like just happened, and I was really happy that the whole process was just so seamless.
Yeah, and then that brings me back to the key thing that I want to talk about, and that's about the fact that when students learn how the intersection between climate change and perhaps other existential issues, or even their own growth, sustainable development of the country and everything, it could prompt them to be able to ask more questions. And then when they do that, they are also going to push their MPs. I'm saying this because again, I'm not trying to knock anybody, but most Nigerian politicians would prefer if the conversation is about something that they call tangibles.
True.
The suit issue was a tangible that they could see. People were complaining every day, so flooding, people were complaining every day about it, so it will be interesting to see how we can navigate through that, get children to know more about climate change and how it intersects with critical issues, everyday problems that we face, so that they can elevate it in another student MP climate surgery, discuss this with their MPs and see how they can prompt them to take action. That sounds to me like a new trajectory, a new pathway that we can explore, going forward. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I would say 1,000%. Let me go beyond 100% right now, because I feel what is happening right now is not the awareness. The awareness is there, but it is the knowledge.
Okay.
It's different from you are aware of something and you know that this is happening. There has been a lot of awareness drive in climate change, and there's been a lot of science prediction trajectories about climate change, but people don't know this. People hear the word climate, there's an awareness, but do people know that climate has environmental footprint? Yeah, because that is what I feel, because we bringing it to the kids, to the students, and they were able to, at first, remember they said, we don't know what climate change is. We don't know if it's happening. But when I brought the environmental footprint close to them to know that these are the exacerbated effect or environmental consequences of climate change, they were able to identify that, yes, this is true. And like you said, tangibles. If we can be able to give our members of parliament tangibles driven by students and not just by, carrying placards, which is very, very important, raising awareness, but driven by students, which they can also feel this sense of belonging. Because come to think of it, as a father, waking up one morning and knowing that your child just woke up to ask you, Dad, did you see the flood that just happened? And you're a member of parliament. Do you think we can be in that same situation? You know, it brings this sense of responsibility. It makes them to become more proactive. But the reason why there has been a lot of loopholes is because there is a lot of knowledge gap. And that is what I feel the student MP, the first phase, which I know is a continuous project, has done. For these places we've been able to, you know, take these projects to, it has closed a lot of knowledge gap. It has given them this awareness to know that this is what is happening. And beyond just that, like, the next phase right now we should be looking at is how to make these students start asking tangible questions. Yeah, start asking tangible questions to their members of parliament, not just not just random questions, but tangible questions that even relate to their own health, to their own environment, to like transportation. You know, ask these climate-related questions that are environmentally driven. Because I can tell you, like, I've been to places where people say climate change don't exist, but when I start pointing out the environmental footprint, they'll be like, I never knew about this until now.
So
So I want to just refer back to where we are now, yeah? And all of the points that you've made are very vital in terms of the value of connecting members of parliament with their constituents, who are students, because they are the future voters. So of course they have the moral voice, but they are also, why MPs pay attention is because they know this is their constituency. They want to make sure that the next generation is going to vote for them. So there is that political self-interest aspect of it. But if we just look at the slide which is up behind us now, so of course one of the things that we did during the Africa COP was to bring these experiences from Nigeria, from Senegal, and you spoke about them in the first ever Children and Youth Pavilion at COP27. So if you want to just reflect a little bit, Nameka, I know you were there, and you were both there, on the importance of this kind of international sharing of the lessons that are emerging through the work that we are doing, and how we can take it to the next level.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that one of the key things from this particular engagement anyway was the fact that you could see that some form of collaboration was built, you know, going forward. And then you realize that some of the problems that you've identified in your own space is also occurring in another space, you know. Because I know that UNICEF took this forward eventually, and then in Nigeria they've been able to work seriously on developing a curriculum, integrating into the Nigerian curriculum conversations on climate change. It hasn't been approved, but I know that the last report was just a few days before I left for COP. You know, that was when it was finally adopted by the entire people who made up. But the critical thing about all of these international engagements and then reaching out to people from other parts of the world is that you begin to share experiences, you begin to share ideas. What worked for you? How would I replicate that? If I replicate what worked for you, would it work for me? You know, so when you share these ideas, you begin to see similarities in perhaps things that are happening within a particular place with what is happening in yours, or with similarities in governance structures from your country to another country. And then you begin to interrogate what has worked for them. And I remember MP Amer Sabah talking at the UK pavilion the other day, where she mentioned that her climate change bill that she submitted was hugely influenced by the Nigerian Climate Change Act. You know, so these are some of the things. You know, when you share ideas, you begin to see what works for these people, the possibility of it working for you, especially if you have similar governance structures. So that's why this is very, very important.
Just to bring things to a close and to look to the future. So if I can just ask you to just go back to the slide where we had the school's climate curriculum, because what we're doing at Globe is at the top level, we are urging parliaments to hold the executive to account. So that's a traditional function that has been of organizations such as Globe, where members of the executive are forced to come before parliamentarians and account for action or inaction. But this represents something which is very bottom up. It's the other side of the relationship that members of parliament have with their constituents. And this is something which typically gets lost in a lot of the noise. Where we ask them to come, they then have to come before their constituents, their youngest constituents, and account for their actions or inactions. So if you go back to that slide, and this touches on some of the comments that you have made. So all the way back, this one. So what we have found is that what's most important and where the biggest gap is for people to actually understand what climate change means for them. Because I think we are now beyond the point where there is universal climate denial. Because the consensus is so solid now. Yeah. It's very, very rare that you will find in the media any reports challenging the veracity, the reality of climate change. But what most people don't understand is what it means for them, because people think it's something that's happening in other parts of the world. So this was the premise behind the way in which we conceptualized the student climate surgeries, which was there's no point teaching young people in London about what's happening in Bangladesh, because that just perpetuates the mythology that climate change and adaptation to climate change is something that only needs to happen in an at-risk delta part of the world. Well, London is in part of an estuary. We have the Thames. So we are similar to very similar risks. So that's why if you look at the curricula that we developed, one of the key things was for young people to understand in a very hands-on way what London's climate risk means for them, and to bring out some really practical examples of that. So for example, in the summer is when young people have their most important exams. The GCSEs, the A-levels, these take place in the hottest months of the year in London, in June. Now, if you're in a school building which was made in the 1950s, it's a purpose-built building, it's very poorly ventilated, it gets extremely hot. Yeah? So we know that London's climate risk, there are three forms of risk. Heat is one of them. It's the least attended to. And yet, if you're a young person and you're so completely stressed and you've got hours in an exam hall in which you're not permitted to leave, you're undertaking exams under conditions of great stress. You want the authorities to make sure that they are addressing the climate heat risk during those exams. That's one simple example of what it means for young people. Yeah. A second example is we have a significant number of Londoners who are Muslims and who will be they will be fasting during Ramadan. And when Ramadan intersects with the hottest summer months, what happens to those young people? Yeah? And so schools need to understand, again, from the health perspectives, that this is what we're talking about when we talk about adaptation and risk management. So they're very, very practical things. And as you said, Sam, you need to make it really tangible. You made that same point. So this is how you make it tangible. By making young people understand these are present risks, and we need to play a role in, first of all, understanding and highlighting them, and then working with others to solve them. So this, for us, is the next level. This is the next, in terms of the pathway to much better climate literacy and attention to adaptation. This is what we hope to do. You know, whether it's in Nigeria or Senegal or other countries, you mentioned Egypt. Nameka, we worked with Amira Sabir to try and have those surgeries in Egypt. But so your thoughts on the next steps, how we can bring this further, what resources do we need, what help can be secure from members of parliament nationally as well at the state level to help deliver on this ambition?
Yeah, okay. You want to go first? Okay, so I think for Africa it's a little bit unique. It's a little bit different from what's obtainable in the UK or other parts of Europe. So in Africa, we did it the opposite way. In the UK, it was about the members of parliament convening their constituents. In Africa, it was the constituents convening members of parliament.
We did it. The method is that schools and young people, as part of these, they invite them. So it's very much they're the ones.
Okay.
collaboratively their local members of parliament, engaging them?
Okay. So for us, though, it has always been about all of us inviting the members of parliament or writing to the members of parliament, to take action. What I consider to be the next step would be something similar, but it's going to be about education for both sides at the very beginning, because members of parliament from my country, for instance, are not that versed when it comes to issues of climate change. They wouldn't know what to do when it comes to taking action, so you need to point them in the right direction. So it's going to be a question of education for both, education for the children and education for the members of parliament, and then we'll take it from there. So the very first thing to do would be to provide proper engagements between first with parliamentarians and then with the students, to educate them first on issues of climate change, necessary steps to take for the members of parliament, and then you now bring the children to also interact with them. I say this because you also mentioned the issue of using local examples, because this was one of the things that we did in Nigeria. But when you were in Abia State and you're talking about climate change and you want to give the kids examples of tangibles, you talk about gully erosion. You wouldn't talk about the rising sea level. You will talk about gully erosion. In rivers, you will talk about rising sea level. You talk about the sea situation. In Ocean, you could talk about a little bit of land degradation, irregular rainfall. You can also say the same thing in Abia State. So the point is that you just have to use local examples to be able to drive up more interest, and then get them to also take more action. I would like to end on this particular point, just to move on from the issue of education for both. I've listened to MPs like MP Chris Kidmore have all of these brilliant ideas, write books on net zero, how to hold parliaments accountable, parliaments to hold the governments accountable and everything. And I'm really, really, really yearning to see a Nigerian parliamentarian perhaps step up to have that level of knowledge and all of that. So it also goes down to our electoral system. Perhaps we should consider that in addition to providing all this education for MPs and the children, we should also consider a reformation of our electoral system, so that we begin to elect people who are knowledgeable about some of these issues. Critically to that is the issue of allocation of committees. I had a conversation with you sometime when you were saying you actually thought that the chair of committees are people who have expertise in that particular thing, and I said in Nigeria it's not done that way. So luckily the clerk of the House Committee on Environment from House of Representatives of Environment in Nigeria is here. So in Nigeria, committee chair is not allocated based on your knowledge or expertise or passion for any particular thing. It's based on what suits the speaker. So again, that's something else that we have to look into while we are reforming the electoral system, while we are providing education for all of them. We also need to interrogate the way in which committees are allocated, and say that for critical committees like the environment, climate change, health, education, you need to allocate those committees to only people who have the requisite qualification to be able to effectively drive action through those committees. So that's where I would like to end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And Nemeka and Manili, I think, have pointed out a whole lot of points which I 100% agree with, and I wouldn't want to take much further ado. But just to add to what they have said, is to create a platform for knowledge exchange, where exchange programs, can run across like interparliamentary exchange programs on climate change. Because the reason why I say this is because I know, I like quoting this from Margaret Mead. She said, "Culture is unique to culture bearers," and if there are exchange programs among parliamentarians, I feel it will help them, identify what is actually happening in their own constituency. Because how this whole thing is structured is you knowing that you are there to represent a constituency, and you're not there just to represent yourself. And how to represent your constituency is spotlighting challenges your constituencies are facing. And Another step moving forward is also like adopting more of the bottom-top approach, where students have easy access to their members of parliament, and not just putting on a lot of bureaucracies. So there should be a loosened process of information, of communication flow, where students can have easy access to their members of parliament, and the student MP program should be more consistent. It should be something that is embedded into the school's activity, not just something that comes up every day, but it could be more like maybe a quarterly program or an annual program, where students have this symposium where they engage with their members of parliament to start, having not just asking them questions, but have a conversation with them. It will be more like an interaction where they have this exchange of views, exchange of perspective, and students and members of parliament come together to develop solutions where students play a role, members of parliament also play a role, because by so doing, it gives both parties sense of belonging on what to do to make sure that this particular issue is being addressed, and there is a collective effort in making sure that the future is more sustainable, not just for the present, but even in time to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your closing thoughts, recommendations, remarks. So in terms of going forward, so three things from our side. If you could just please put it back to one of the earlier slides, if you just go back to this one, the next one. Okay, this is fine, yeah. So the work that we do on the Schools Climate Summit and the work that we do with the Student MP Climate Surgeries is profoundly interlinked, because we don't look at young people in schools as just a stakeholder. We look at schools as part of an ecosystem, because it makes it much easier for then those solutions that you're talking about to be considered in a holistic way. So there are a couple of things that stand out. So in terms of the three things that I mentioned going forward, the first is that in the UK and in other Commonwealth countries, you do have constituency members of parliament. In the UK, you have a tradition of a surgery. This is not common to all parliamentary systems, but it's very useful because you have one day in the week when the member of parliament is expected to come back to their constituency and engage with their constituents. Typically, young people have not been notable constituents, but they now have voice. And so one of the things that we are very keen to see is to have a day set aside by members of parliament, a surgery day, in which, for whatever the duration is, 4 times a year, 8 times a year, but have set days when they engage with schools in their constituencies. Not just activist groups, but schools, because schools are anchor institutions in countries, and especially in countries which have a very sizable youthful population, it means that this is where you engage with your young people most effectively. The second thing is that, as I mentioned, looking at schools. So if you look at the slide behind you, we think of schools, have to think of themselves as a system, working with each other, but also individually looking both at what the school environment is like in terms of the campus environment, looking at the curriculum, what they are being taught, but it's not enough. You have to look at the way the school engages with other community members. So schools, the boards of governors who run schools, the parents and carers associations, the business managers, the facilities managers who run schools, they're all part of the community. The faith organizations in the community, the business organizations. And then, of course, look at it from the careers point of view. So today we're also looking at green skills. The green energy transition will not occur if there isn't a focus on skills. So what are the career pathways that young people are being informed about? That's also part of the work that we do. And finally, how do we resource all this, right? So if I think of, first of all, as I mentioned, the focus on having a day set aside, which is a surgery. The second is thinking of schools as a system. And the third is to take it forward in a very, very pragmatic way. So we are coming out of COP. We hope that part of what will happen in the next round of Student MP Climate Surgeries in Nigeria will be connecting that conversation to the outcomes at COP. So just like we ask for parliaments to hold hearings so that the executive can hold themselves to account, it's for schools to organize these local hearings, constituency hearings, because that then means that a member of parliament who's never heard of COP is going to have to do their homework. Yeah, it's getting members of parliament to do their homework and take these issues more seriously. So that's what's in the plans for the coming year. But thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your practical experiences in Nigeria and beyond. So thank you both, Namika and Sam,
Thank you
and
very
thank
much.
you everyone who's joining us online.